people who have been late and lollygoggling in the hall, please take your seats so we can start the business session. I forgot how well the commission runs their meetings and how they move those time frames up, so my apologies for my lateness. So welcome for the business session. My name is Jim Gilmore. I'm chairman of the commission, and for at least another 5 minutes. And we'll be going through a few things for the committee, the business session today. So first off, we need approval of the agenda. It was in your meeting packet. Any changes to the agenda? Seeing none. We need approval for the proceedings from the August 2019. Has everybody reviewed that? Are there any changes to the proceedings? Okay, seeing none, we will adopt those by unanimous consent. Public comment, any items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move right along. And we're going to go into item 4, and we're going to review and consider approval of the 2020 action plan, and Bob's going to take us through that. So Bob, it's all yours.
Sorry about that. Just before we get into this, the action plan, if you guys will remember, changed formats quite a bit last year based on some input from the leadership of the commission. We pared it down quite a bit. It used to be 50+ pages. We've cut it in half. It really focuses on new activities and highlights for the next year. So it's a lot shorter. And what we'll do right now is ask Tony to ask each of us staff members to go through our sections quickly, just hit the highlights of the highlights, and you guys can ask any questions. But keep in mind, generally, if you want to add a significant task to the action plan, we probably need to take something off. We're kind of, the way it's written right now, we're pretty well maxed out on dollars and on staff time. So, any significant changes, we'll need to start talking about swaps in and out. So with that, I'll ask Tony to go ahead and go first through section 1, which is the species management actions and stock assessment work.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to go through, start with the high priority species and try to hit most of the things that are in the bold. I may skip over 1 or 2 things. Some of the things that are in the high priority species that are not in bold are still important things, but we've been carrying on those tasks over the course of the last year, so we did not bold them. So we will start with Atlantic herring, and one of the questions that we first off have is whether or not Atlantic herring should be in the medium-low priority or in the high priority. We'll be working with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to complete a management track stock assessment per peer review. In August, we'll have the board review that and then potentially review and adjust 2021 specifications if necessary. We'll also work with the council, if necessary, to extend spawning into Area 3. The council has initiated a framework to do that. In addition, yesterday, the herring board initiated an addendum to look at quota, how they allocate the quota allocations, as well as how they manage the Area 1A days out section of that fishery. For Atlantic menhaden, we'll work to resolve the implementation of the Chesapeake Bay cap, and the technical committee and the board will review the recommendations from the aerial survey project, and then the board will need to determine the next steps. For Atlantic striped bass, we'll implement Addendum 6, including any conservation equivalency proposals if those are brought forward, as well as consider management response to rebuild the biomass and address long-term fishery issues, meaning the potential initiation of an amendment. For black sea bass, and this would also most likely include summer flounder and scup. We'll work with the Mid-Atlantic Council and NOAA Fisheries on an addendum or an amendment on reforming the recreational management and commercial recreational allocation, taking into account calibrated recreational estimates. And it's likely that this activity could extend beyond 2020. And bluefish will continue with the amendment to address allocation. as well as a rebuilding program which was added recently. The stock is fished. Thank you, Dustin. For horseshoe crab, today the board began a revision to the adaptive resource management framework to use to utilize the modeling approaches from the most recent benchmark assessment. For summer flounder, we'll develop with the Mid-Atlantic Council, and this will be for scup as well as black sea bass, an amendment that looks at sector allocations, taking into account all the recalibrated estimates, as well as participate in a workshop with the council on their research steering committee to examine the possibility of reestablishing an RSA program. For Tautog, we'll initiate the development of a stock assessment for completion in 2021. American eel will work on the development of the next benchmark stock assessment methodologies, including working with USGS and Canada on that issue. Moving down, coastal sharks will be monitoring the 2019 shortfin mako stock assessment update that's being completed through ICAT, as well as work with CDAR to complete the black tip stock assessment for peer review in November, and then the board would review this in February of 2021. Northern shrimp will conduct a stock assessment update. For red drum, we'll work with the Assessment Science Committee to develop a roadmap for the next benchmark stock assessment. Spanish mackerel, we will work with the South Atlantic Council. This has not necessarily been initiated, but we anticipate it will be at the upcoming South Atlantic Board meeting to initiate management action to ensure that we have complementary regulations in both state and federal waters. And we'll also work with CDAR for a benchmark stock assessment that would be peer-reviewed in 2021. And for winter flounder, we will work with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to prepare a management track stock assessment for peer review, and that would be reviewed by the board in October. On cross-cutting issues, we'll work to raise awareness of regulatory changes affecting data collection for things like American lobster, American eel, and tautog, as well as work with the states and NOAA fisheries on changes to the take reduction plan for the North Atlantic right whales. And I will take I think that's all. Any questions?
Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tony, what's the difference under black sea bass or summer flounder? You use sector allocations instead of commercial recreational allocations, and what's the difference?
It's commercial recreational allocations. We're just calling it a sector. I can change the language to say commercial recreational allocations.
Okay, so they mean the same thing.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure I raise this at the mid-meeting. That could possibly include like a commercial, recreational, and charter allocation.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I will note for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, there are a lot of large items that are on the list, and it is highly likely due to staffing issues and the needs to try to get different things done quickly to address certain needs that we may, with the Mid-Atlantic Council, need to determine how to prioritize each of these issues. And we'll continue to have those conversations with the Mid-Atlantic, particularly at the upcoming joint meeting in December.
Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So under black sea bass, the second bullet, consider management action to adjust commercial allocation. At the recent joint meeting, the board voted to initiate an addendum. So is this meant to reflect that? I just didn't know if the wording there should be changed.
Yes. The first bullet, correct?
I guess I was thinking it is two separate management actions. There's the amendment to deal with recreational commercial sector allocation, and then there's the other document, the addendum, to address state-by-state commercial allocation.
We'll add a second sentence.
Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, thank you. Tony, the slide that had cross-cutting issues about the unanticipated impacts of data collection, could you elaborate on those? Yeah, the first bullet, raise awareness of regulatory changes.
Yes. So, for example, what we went through Lobster on Monday, just making sure that we are, in particular, collecting data in the same format for some things with Lobster, for Tautog, recognizing that we are implementing the tagging program and making sure that everybody's aware of that and what potential future data collection needs may be as that tagging program gets moving and out of the gate. For EEL, as we talked about earlier today, the importance of collecting the data and getting it into ACCSP on time in order to monitor that fishery as best as possible.
And Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the last joint meeting, the motion for black sea bass was to start an addendum with the consent of the policy board or the business session. If we approve this, is that consent implicit, or do we have to have a discussion about that?
This would be that consent.
This would be that consent. So how long do you really think that's going to take in time and resources?
I think it depends on the direction that the board goes. Caitlin is going to work on drafting a document, and we're going to work with the Mid-Atlantic Council. We had said that we would not make any decisions on that document without a joint meeting. It is our intent to bring forward that document at the February meeting. We need to see if the Mid-Atlantic Council can come to our February meeting so we can approve that document for public comment. If the board wants additional options added to the document, then it will take longer. But if we are on that track, then it could be finalized as early as May, or it may take a little longer depending on how much wordsmithing and option changing the board has.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Are you saying that final action could be in May?
That would be the fastest.
I don't see it that way. If you're talking about reallocation, it's going to be an issue with tremendous economic impact one way or the other, depending on what end of the seesaw you're on. And I would think that's going to be something that's going to take years. And I don't know if the commission is willing to commit to such a broad topic at this time, given the workload that it's going to be. I would much rather see a more specific action come out, or language come out of the joint meeting before we got too carried away with whether we want to get wrapped up for 3, 4, 5 years doing it.
You're speaking just on the commercial allocation, not the commercial recreational allocation.
And on both. I mean, it's very hard for me to justify spending a lot of time on reallocating fisheries when you have a limited access fishery which has no ability due to management to increase their catch to get more quota, and an open access fishery that can increase their catch, as we all know, exponentially. It doesn't add up to me, and I don't think it's fair. And I don't think we should spend the time or the money doing it.
Well, that lit everybody up. All right, Doug Grau.
Thank you, Tony. I noticed under Atlantic Herring where you're suggesting moving that to a medium-low priority. Could I hear a little bit more rationale behind why you are proposing that?
It is a question to the board. It wasn't it was just a question of whether it should be in high or low priority. Typically, a lot of times when we have issues that are in high priority. They have management actions associated with them. We did just add a management action, so it could, stay there. It was, and we were just working on the assessment. We knew that the Mid-Atlantic or the New England Council was going to be working on the framework for the offshore spawning, and so it was to the prerogative of the board.
Okay, I would suggest, especially since we added a management action, that it probably should remain in the high priority.
Yeah, that makes sense, Doug. Tom Foti.
I'm sorry, I just walked in on the tail end of Eric's conversation there, but I think that should be one of our highest priorities. After seeing the new MREP numbers, I'm looking at that the recreational community, and I always thought it, took a real hit on when we set up the quotas. And basically, we're looking now to adjust those quotas to reflect what the actual fisheries were. And especially what happened with the MREP numbers showing that now we're overfishing, the recreational's way over its quota on this, and ridiculous things like scub. So it's important that we do this, and the community is looking for you to basically do this as fast as possible, and we need to dedicate the time, effort, and money to do this and accomplish this task. Because the more you do this, the more you're going to lose credit. The longer it takes, the more credibility you look out with the recreational public out there. So I know Eric maybe thinks it's a waste of money, but we've been fighting for this for years and sitting around this table trying to get the right numbers. And if these are the right numbers, we were underestimated all these years. We need to correct those inequities that were caused back in the 90s and go through it again.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I don't disagree. As much as it's going to be, and maybe daunting in a long period, we got to start sometime. So Justin Davis. Other questions? Adam Mawalski.
Thank you. So under Summer Flounder, there is this item about the workshop with the Research Steering Committee. Was just wondering why we would put it here specifically under one species as opposed to it maybe showing up under research, as this would be across a number of species. I'll just add I appreciate it being here as chair of the Research Steering Committee because I do think it's important, so I'm glad it's here on the plan because we will need the support, putting on my council member hat, of the commission in doing so. But again, it's going to be across a number of species would be the intent of that, and perhaps might consider moving it down to Section 2 under research.
We put it here just because it was the species that it most often comes up under. As I said before, it applies obviously to black sea bass and scup. You could say it applies to dogfish and bluefish as well. I could add it to each of the species, or in parentheses afterwards I can just say this also applies to the following species.
Or down to cross-cutting. So again, yep. I am appreciative that it's on here. My only request is that it not be interpreted to only apply to summer flounder. That's my only reason for bringing it up.
Other questions for Tony? Okay, I think we're moving on to science. Bob? Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Goal 2 of the 2020 action plan covers all of the fisheries research and stock assessment activity, as well as research surveys and other monitoring activities. To hit the highlights under the science committees, we are asking the management and science committee to do a couple of things in 2020. The first is to revisit our ASMFC research priorities and to dig through those and look for common themes and develop proposals to seek funding to address research priorities and get better data for our stock assessments. The second is to have the MSC weigh in on our annual status of the stocks review and provide some guidance on how to interpret and use that information. Moving down to data collection, the CMAP program in the South Atlantic will be developing their next 5-year plan for 2021 to 2025, including exploring a new system for coordinated survey data management. Under NEMAP in the Northeast, each year they have a workshop across the various trawl surveys or fishery independent trawl surveys to compare methods, compare notes. So in 2020, we propose conducting a trawl survey calibration workshop in order to better integrate the data between surveys. Moving down, we have highlighted a priority related to the ecosystem modeling and ecosystem reference points to increase data collection to support those ecosystem-based assessments and management, either through new or existing programs like CMAP to get diet information from those survey catches. Under fisheries research, this is where we have our fish aging activity. There's a call for an Atlantic menhaden aging workshop to ensure that all the states or university labs that are gathering and processing menhaden aging samples to make sure they're doing it in a consistent fashion, again, so those data can plug into our stock assessment. And under ecosystem-based management and changing ocean conditions, standardize the timeline of commission assessments to support timely updates to ERP and Atlantic menhaden stock assessments. That's sort of a pending activity. The menhaden single species and ERP assessments will go through a CDAR peer review next week, and we'll bring those results to you in February. We have also highlighted evaluating the effects of changing ocean conditions on stock productivity and distribution. Again, that's an activity that your Management Science Committee has engaged in the past. They are meeting this week, actually still meeting downstairs, and so they are digging back in to address those types of questions. And finally, under competing ocean uses, for the Commission to participate in ROSA, or the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, to provide a forum for the states to discuss interactions between fisheries resources and offshore energy development. Those are the highlights. Mr. Chairman, I'll take any questions.
Questions for Pat? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move into goal 3. Oh, Jeff White. Oh, Jeff, you. Oh, sorry, Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Goal 3 discusses dependable and timely statistics for Atlantic coast fisheries through the activities of the ACCSP. We updated the language on a continuing basis to reflect the new, a couple of new updates, but primarily under program management, the focus is on process enhancement and integrating with the ASMSC communications plan. Under fisheries dependent data collection, items are talking about extending the safest database capabilities and adding some highlights within the redesign on specific tasks that are going to focus on participant structure and trip reporting that are components of that redesign that will be occurring in 2020. And of course, maintaining support of our federal and state agency partners to implement their mandatory electronic trip reporting regulations. Under recreational surveys, there's the extension and implementation of state conduct of MRIP for-hire telephone survey from Maine to Georgia, expanding the electronic data collection tools for both the access point angler intercept survey and for-hire telephone survey, developing methodologies to more fully incorporate the logbooks into the catch statistics, and of course update our our Atlantic recreational implementation plan. That's something that comes back around every 3 to 5 years. Under data distribution and use, there are some changes to the data warehouse queries and structures to include more data fields that are being collected by the partners and SAFIS, adding the addition of biological data feeds and improving our communication with partners and some processes to streamline the data integrity. Under data infrastructure and security, that really speaks for itself, making sure we have the items in place to support larger data volumes and meet with greater security constructs.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions for Jeff? Adam Mawalski.
Under the recreational surveys that are here, and I had some discussions with various people, including from S&T and Silver Spring in the past, about improving access by the public to the surveys. Is that something that can be considered moving forward? I understand it's probably not something that would be done next year, but specifically right now there's a certain level that you can query for a state by wave, but there's been discussions in the past about taking that a step further, being able to see something perhaps on a county by county basis, or perhaps down to an intercept level that people could query or look up. Was just wondering if that information had gotten back to you, if there was any thoughts about that moving forward, laying the groundwork for it, and what it might take moving forward on future action plans.
In terms of what an ACCSP task can be for next year, we can certainly talk with MRIP about what access might or might not be available through their tools. The way the survey is structured, the intercept by intercept information is publicly available on their website through the download tools. It's a matter of finding out a little bit more what it is that you're asking for in terms of pre-programmed access, what analysis, and how that could be done. So we can certainly talk further about it, but I'm not quite sure of a particular action plan item to add at this point.
Other questions for Jeff? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to goal 4. Tony?
So under goal 4, we don't have any new activities. The Law Enforcement Committee will continue to work with the management boards to seek increased and improved compliance with FMPs. The Law Enforcement Committee is continuing on with work on things like lobster and offshore enforcement, which is mentioned in goal 1. But I don't really have anything new if there's any questions.
Any questions on that? Okay, goal 5. Tony?
Goal 5 is looking at the habitat goals, and Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership falls under this goal. The artificial reef programs will work through a comprehensive update to state profiles in updating the profile of Atlantic Artificial Reef Development Source document. The Habitat Committee will work on an acoustics document for the Habitat Management Series. And under the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership, they'll be promoting the Southeast Fish Habitat and the Northeast Fish Habitat mapping projects that were recently completed, as well as develop a fundraising strategy to solicit donations from the private sector to put money towards targeted on-the-ground restoration projects.
Questions on that? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to item 6. Tina's going to do that. Tina?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under stakeholder and public support, the first item is identify 3 to 4 high-profile issues and seek to proactively address stakeholder criticisms and concerns through various outreach tools. The next is promoting high-profile species through and stock assessment results through various outreach initiatives, with our focus species for 2020, lobster, cobia, herring, Atlantic menhaden and ERPs, shad, Spanish mackerel, and winter flounder. Under facilitate stakeholder participation, we have evaluate the effectiveness of current advisory panel process and consider possible changes to enhance engagement and provide management boards with useful stakeholder input, as well as explore additional tools to gather public comment and proposed management actions. Under Media Relations and Networking, increase interdepartmental coordination on outreach activities through the development of a strategic communications plan. And that's it for outreach.
Any questions for Tina? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to Goal 7, and Bob's going to lead that one. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Goal 7 is our legislative activities at the Commission, mostly the ones that Deke and I engage in and a number of you engage in, reaching out to Capitol Hill on the Commission's priorities and wants and desires. Most of this is ongoing activity, just continued engagement with a series of offices on Capitol Hill, as well as the professional staff for a number of the committees on the House and Senate side. We did update the list of pending legislation emerging issues that we'll be working on and we've had questions about recently. So there's a pretty long list there, including forage, fish, and state-by-state allocations and monuments and energy initiatives and a number of other things. So we'll be working to keep offices informed on what's going on at ASMSC relative to those issues and bring back any information that they provide to this commission. And then moving down, we always convey the funding priorities for ASMFC to appropriation staff as well as individual offices. So we'll continue to do that. And this just reflects the priorities, and the Regional Council and Fishery Commission line is one of the most important lines that we always look out for, and that provides the primary funding to ASMFC as well as out to the states to implement the provisions of the Atlantic Coastal Act. And the final new bullet is a new initiative, primarily out of the Gulf, but involving ASMFC and the Pacific states, is to potentially change or increase Wallet Bro funding to the Commission. But we need to make sure, as that moves forward, there's no, if it's a zero-sum game, where does that money come from? So we want to make sure there's no negative impacts to the states if we're able to get more money to the Commission. So those are the highlights of the legislative activity, and just as a bit of an advertisement, Deke and I are always willing to go up to Capitol Hill with anyone. If you want to go up there, we can set meetings up, and when we're in Crystal City, we'll run you over to DC anytime you want. So that's Goal 7.
Thanks, Bob. Tom Foti.
Yeah, at the Mid-Atlantic Council, we had gotten to a discussion about the funding of MRAPs and the money that was necessary. And Dr. John Borman, when we basically talked about what he said in 2007 before Congress about the funding of MRAPs to get really decent numbers, what you needed to do was $50 million, not the $11 million we've still been spending, 11 to 13. The following week I was at MAFAC, and I brought that up to Paul, I can't think of his last name, but maybe Bob knows, who actually handles the budget for the National Marine Fisheries Service, and we talked about this $50 million. So I was hoping that the Commission can also basically say that we need to really fund the MREP numbers to where the scientists have said we always need to be, and the money that's necessary to do it properly. We spend a lot of money gathering commercial statistics, but we really don't spend the necessary. The MREP numbers are probably better than they were before, but they don't compare to how we get numbers for the commercial fishery. Until we basically start spending the money, we're going to be sitting around this table arguing whether the numbers are valid, whether they really reflect what's going on. And I don't know if $50 million will do it, but maybe we can get maybe $20 million and actually start doing a better job and basically increase it over the years. So hopefully the Commission will basically do that when they're lobbying on the Hill.
Thanks, Tom. I think the name you're looking for was Paul DeRemus. And when Deke and I go to the Hill, we do, I often comment how important funding recreational data collection is. So we do convey that message, but we'll add it to the list here just so it is spelled out directly, and we'll keep working on that.
Bill Hyatt.
Just a suggestion to add the Recovering America's Wildlife to that list of pending legislation of emerging issues. I know it's something that you have been forwarding information to us on, and it's something that could be important, so just add it to the list.
Thanks, Bill. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bob, could you elaborate a little more about the federal aid funding here? I know the reauthorization for federal aid right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking to take a bigger bite out of the pot for administrative purposes. And I'm just wondering what part of the federal aid funds would this be coming out of?
That's a good question. That's one I need. That's why we're keeping an eye on this. What the bottom line is, ASMSC our office receives about $200,000 per year from Wallabro, and that's been fixed since 1987, I believe. So we're looking to, work with the other commissions to possibly increase that. But again, if there is an opportunity to increase that, it can't be at the expense of any programs or anything that, funds your state programs and the money that goes directly to the state. So, if it is a zero-sum game, which I think it is, I mean, the pool of money, the Wallabro fund has increased over time. So there might be some additional funds available. So we'll just have to see how this goes. And it's not far enough along to show where that money would come from. So we're going to monitor it and see if it's a good idea or a bad idea, I guess is the best way to phrase it.
Any other questions for Bob? Okay, goal 8, Laura?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Goal 8 is ensuring the fiscal stability and efficient administration of the Commission. So it's ongoing in and out daily routine that we do every day. We will do a couple of things next year. First one is develop a revised statement of work for the IJ cooperative agreement to respond to the new federal grant reporting requirements. The second one is researching options for staff performance review, changing the form that we use or changing the format, any number of changes there. And then conducting a workshop on parliamentary procedures and meetings management for commissioners. That concludes.
Thanks, Laura. Questions for Laura? Okay, seeing none, we're going to need a motion to adopt this, so unless there's any other discussion on the document or anything that wasn't brought up. Okay, we got a motion by Pat Kelleher, seconded by John Clark. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we'll adopt that by unanimous consent, and I'd like to thank the staff for doing a great job on the strategic plan and, great presentation. So, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick comment on the action plan. The action plan, or review of the action plan, is also on the executive committee agenda for tomorrow morning, but it's really just to look at or start diving into some of the issues that are included in the document. Public engagement, advisory panel process, those sorts of things need some development and a plan for how we're going to move forward next year. So the executive committee is going to talk about that in the morning. I don't anticipate any significant changes to the action plan itself, just sort of starting the details on how we're going to work through some of these issues. So it's not a second review, it's just sort of a deeper dive into a couple of the issues.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, our next action item is elections of the officers, so I'm going to relinquish the chair and turn it over to Bob and go back to my caucus. So, Bob, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the last time I say that, I think. Before I call on Doug to do the report from the nominating committee, I want to, Jim, don't go too far away just yet, please. I want to thank you. Can you open that? Yeah, can you? No, flips open. Jim, on behalf of staff and all the commissioners, we want to thank you for 2 great years of service. We've got a crystal clock for you. I'll really miss working with Jim. Every Friday at 1 o'clock we've got a standing call, and I get to get the play-by-play details of that week's artificial reef trials and tribulations in New York, which always don't go that well. So, it's been a lot of fun working with Jim. He's a great boss to have for me, and he's been, a huge supporter of this commission, works really hard, put in a lot of hours kind of behind the scenes between these meetings to help this process work as smoothly as it does. So on behalf of all of us, Jim, thank you for 2 years.
Thank you very much, and I'm humbled, and now it's over to Bob. Thanks.
All right, now I'll turn it right back over to Doug then. He can do the hard work here. Doug, can you give the nominating committee report, please?
Well, we have, are you going to describe at some point the process for the vote at all, or do you want me to? Go ahead.
Okay,
Why
I'll do that.
Why don't you start off with that, and then I'll be glad to provide the nominating committee.
I'll do that. So The commission voting process is that for every other year when we elect the chair and the vice chair, we go through a balloting process. It sometimes seems a little bit cumbersome, but it's not. It's to allow for write-in votes or for other people to be nominated from the floor. And it was agreed that that's the most open and fair process. So once Doug provides the nominating committee's nomination for chair, we'll pass out the ballots for chair. Deke has the ballots ready to go, and then we'll count those votes. And then we'll move on to vice chair and go through the same process of a ballot and votes for the vice chair. One vote, yes, one vote per state, please. So caucus, and hopefully you guys all agree. Yeah, you'll get one ballot. I don't know where Pat's been the last couple hours. We'll see who he's been talking to, so we'll see. With that, Doug, are you ready to go for the nominating committee report?
I am ready. We queried all the commissioners looking for suggestions for chair and vice chair. All of the responses seem to focus around a couple of what we've believed to be great candidates. The first one for chair, I'm going to be, I think there's going to be a formal motion for this, that on behalf of the nominating committee, I nominate Pat Kelleher as chair of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, effective at the end of the annual meeting.
Thank you, Doug. Since this is a committee motion, it does not need a second. With that, we'll pass out the ballots and we'll conduct the vote. Yeah, good luck. We'll give you all the time you need over there.
I have a report that we have approved Pat Kelleher as chairman for the next 2 years by unanimous consent.
Congratulations, Pat.
Congratulations, Pat.
Would you like to say anything?
And next on our agenda.
I was just going to just remind everybody that I've talked to about becoming chair, that as I promised, a lobster in every pot will come true tonight on behalf of the state of New Hampshire.
That is fast work. Doug, can you give the nomination for the vice chair, please?
Yes, the nominating committee would like to bring forward Spud Woodward, and on behalf of the nominating committee, I nominate Spud Woodward as vice chair of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, effective at the end of the annual meeting.
Is the accounting firm of Grout & Grout ready to report the results?
Yes, I am, and I'm pleased to I'm pleased to say that we have Spud Woodward has been elected vice chair by unanimous consent.
Bob?
Yes, Mr. Abbott.
Yes, thank you, Bob. I'd just like to comment on the election we just held. Having been here for over 20 years, I can recall close to 20 years ago, Pat Kelleher was here lobbying for CCA. So now he's the chair, which I think is significant, and I congratulate him. Secondly, I'd like to comment that 20 years ago, the legislators and the governor's appointees did not have a seat at the table. And here we are 20 years later, and proudly we elect Spud Woodward as our vice chair. And I think that's a significant step in Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I congratulate Spud, I congratulate Pat. I'm sure there'll be a wonderful slate of officers. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dennis. Any other comments? Spud, would you like to say anything as the incoming vice chair?
Well, I made sure that I got here early as I could on Sunday, because I spent 4 hours across the border in Maine with a voice coach teaching me how to understand what Pat was going to say whenever he had conversations with me. And I'm certainly willing to reciprocate. I've got some good voice coaches down in Georgia that can do likewise for him, to make sure that when I speak, he understands what I say, and when he speaks, I do likewise. So.
Thanks, Bud. Yeah, I think my hardest job for the next 2 years is going to be translator between both of you guys, but I'll give it a go. Tom, yes, please.
I hate to correct Dennis, but I will. When I first got to the commission, the only place we were allowed to vote was at nominating for the chair and vice chair, because it was a caucus vote at the business meeting. So we actually were able to vote. And the second year I was a commissioner in 1991, we decided to have some fun. And it was the only time we had 7 ballots, and they were all tied, because we were trying to get a governor's appointee and elected, actually a legislative appointee elected. And the compromise was to get a governor's appointee, and that was the first one. That was Mickey Newberger. The second one over the years was Bonnie Brown, Dr. Bonnie Brown from Virginia. But she won the election without any controversy at all. There was no ballots. It was just a single ballot. Of course, then she basically didn't get reappointed, so I decided never to nominate another governor's appointee. So I always said it was a kiss of death. So it's nice to see Spud get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anything else to come before the business session today? I'm going to fill some time while Laura gets the answer to a question that we have. Tonight's event will be at the Elks Club, and there will be trolleys that leave the front door at 6:20, Laura? No, 10 to 6. 10 to 6, sorry. 5:50. It's very close to 10 to 6.
In my world, it's the same.
Yeah. We can round off a few minutes before the hour. So yeah, and there'll be a couple of those running in a cycle back and forth, right? It's pretty close. So as you heard last night, the dress for tonight is casual, not even business casual, casual. Well modeled, Richie, good job. And tomorrow morning, the executive committee meeting has moved rooms. It's going to be in Garden Ballroom B downstairs. So the executive committee there, for those on executive committee, breakfast will be served starting at 7:30 tomorrow morning. Seeing no other hands, the business session will recess until Thursday at 10 a.m. Thank you all. In good shape. So this policy is kind of theoretical. Good news is it doesn't apply to anyone right away, so it's always easier to approve these policies when they don't have to immediately impact the state. And we ask our attorney to look back at all of our guiding documents at the commission, the charter and the compact and everything else, and there really is no provisions in any of those documents right now to address states that are behind on their paying of the dues to the commission. So the executive committee has chatted about this a couple times, and this policy reflects kind of the current thinking of the executive committee. They, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, they approved this document or recommended that this document be approved at their meeting earlier this week. So with that, I'll quickly go through what's included here. And really what it is a series of notifications to the state that is late on their payment, late on a payment, with ultimately the end could be that if the state is significantly in arrears, they would actually lose their ability to vote at ASMFC. So they'd be allowed to come to meetings, participate in the boards, but when it came to votes, that state would not be able to cast any vote at the management board, policy board, or business session level. So with that, the graphic on the last page, I think, is probably the most important part. I can quickly go through that. April 1st of each year, we already send out our bills to the states that let the states know what their annual dues are. And that payment that's billed on April 1st isn't actually due until June 30th of the subsequent year. So you get about a 14 or a 16-month notice that, you have a bill due at the commission. So you got quite a while to respond to that bill and pay the bill. So first notice will be April 1st. 6 months later, on October 1st, the commission would remind any state that has not paid their dues that they have dues due on upcoming June 30th. We'd have another reminder January 1st, 9 months from the original bill date, and say essentially the same thing, that you have a bill or your dues are due to the commission on June 30th. That moves us along to June 30th of year 2, essentially from the bill date. And that's when the payments are due. If any state does not submit payments on time on the following day, July 1st, the executive director would notify in writing the governor and the 3 commissioners from that state of an overdue payment. At the August summer meeting, a state would be able to come forward to the executive committee and make an appeal to say, hey, we've had special conditions in our state. This is why our bill is later. This is why we've only paid part of our bill, or whatever it may be. And that state can start that appeal at the executive committee. If the executive committee concurs with that state, the executive committee could recommend to the full commission that some leniency be granted to that state, and the state, may not, or could be given more time to submit payment to the commission. If no leniency is given and the bill is not paid by October 1st, which is 18 months after the original billing date, that state would then, that's when the loss of voting privileges would occur. So what would happen if the commission approves this policy is we would amend the rules and regulations to reflect this change. Again, the important part to note here is that it seldom happens. It's a rare occasion where a state gets into arrears, which is, thank you all for paying on time and very quickly. And most folks are way ahead with their dues payments. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a quick summary of the policy, or the draft policy. Happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Bob? Seeing none, we need a motion for this, right, Bob? Do we just put up the motion from the executive committee, or do we just put up a separate one and adopt it?
I think, a motion that says move to modify the commission's rules and regulations to implement the policy on non-payment of state appropriations would probably be good.
So who would like to make that motion? Steve Train, second to the motion. Justin Davis. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, any objection to the motion that we haven't put up yet? Trust us, staff will get it right. They never fail. So we'll move along, and if we'll put it up, and if there's anything wrong, we'll fix it. Okay, I'll read it into the record. Move to amend the Commission's rules and regulations to implement the policy on non-payment of state appropriations. Motion by Mr. Train, second by Dr. Davis. I'll do it again. Any discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we will adopt it by unanimous consent. Okay, next order of business are non-compliance findings. I think we just recycle the motion from the policy board. We'll put that back up. Okay, I'm going to read this into the record. Doug, you have any good jokes on before you leave? Okay, on behalf of the Interstate Fisheries Management Program Policy Board, move that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission find the Commonwealth of Virginia out of compliance for not fully and effectively implementing and enforcing Section 4.3.7 Chesapeake Bay Reduction Fishery Cap of Amendment 3 to the Interstate Fishery Management Plan for Atlantic Menhaden. The Commonwealth of Virginia must implement an annual total allowable harvest from the Chesapeake Bay by the reduction fishery of no more than 51,000 metric tons. The implementation of this measure is necessary to achieve the goals and objectives of the Fishery Management Plan and maintain the Chesapeake Bay marine environment to assure the availability of the ecosystem's resource on a long-term basis. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we will adopt it by unanimous consent. That brings us to our Resolutions Committee. So I understand that Steve Murphy, the chair of the Resolution Committee, is going to have something for us. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy Halloween. Congratulations to the Nationals on their win. I didn't know I was on the Resolutions Committee. I think I got voluntold for this, but here's our best shot at it. Whereas the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission conducted its 78th annual meeting in the spectacular coastal town of Newcastle, New Hampshire, which provided a magnificent venue for the commissioners, commission staff, and committee members to deliberate on difficult issues of mutual concern. And whereas the weather was crisp and cool and a bit damp, perhaps indicative of a traditional New England fall, but what we call in the South, winter. Whereas the place is full of rocks, the deer are tame, the tides are insane, and if you have 45 minutes to spare, you can drive the entire coast, but your car will get wet. Whereas we have all been mesmerized by the stunning beauty of the fall colors and refreshed by the wholesale dearth of loblolly pine trees and Spanish moss. Whereas the New Hampshire Commissioners' spouses outdid themselves by providing an outstanding gift bag, including homegrown honey courtesy of Dennis Abbott, maple syrup, which is difficult to carry on board your airplane, and Cherie's hand-turned pens, and the spouse gift bag including a rock, which really is not as odd as it sounds. Whereas the gracious host state of New Hampshire and the Commission provided most excellent adult beverages and hors d'oeuvres at the Monday reception, especially when you strategically station yourself near the kitchen door. And whereas the Commission recognized outstanding leadership and habitat conservation efforts of the Massachusetts DMF eelgrass team, including Tay Evans, Jillian Carr, Caitlin Fred, and Alex Borey with the Commission's Melissa Laser Habitat Conservation Award. And whereas the spouse and guest tour of Portsmouth was a huge success, visiting Strawberry Bank, lunch at the Orr House, followed by shopping and sightseeing. And whereas the annual ASMFC banquet, our host provided each of us with the biggest lobster dinner many of us have ever had, also resulting in what might be deemed a lobster coma, causing many of us to fall asleep and miss most of Game 6 of the World Series. And whereas rumors are circulating that the Maine delegation was concerned about the optics of being seen consuming New Hampshire lobsters and opted for chicken. And whereas Roy Miller presented the Captain David H. Hart Award to Tom Foti, a most deserving recipient, who also has an uncanny ability to remember every person he ever met, what they said, and repeat it to you. And whereas the 28th annual Laura Leach Fishing Tournament was a huge success in supporting two charities helping introduce kids to fishing, with prizes being awarded to almost every state north of the Mason-Dixon line. And whereas Jim Gilmore was recognized for a job well done as he steps down as chair, Pat Kelleher slides one chair to the right as he takes on this leadership role, with Spud taking on his dream role of retirement as the vice chair, both unanimously elected by the commission. Now therefore let it be resolved that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission expresses its profound appreciation to the New Hampshire Commissioners, Doug Grout, David Waters, represented by the Venerable Dennis Abbott, and Richie White, and the staff of the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, especially Cherie Patterson, for their terrific assistance in the planning and execution of this outstanding 78th annual meeting.
Very well done, Steve, and without objection, I think we will adopt that by unanimous consent as a resolution. Job well done. Is there any other business to come before the business session? Seeing none, I will hand the baton off to Pat, and we are adjourned. Thank you.